Hey, what's going on, guys? So you picked yourself up a Sony a6300, just getting started with things, and you're trying to figure out exactly how to make it look cinematic. Well, right now I'm about to give you guys a couple tips to get you started to make everything that you shoot look cinematic. Keep in mind that these tips also go hand in hand with any other camera that you're going to be utilizing, so if you don't have a Sony a6300, you got yourself something else, then just take some of these tips and apply it to whatever camera that you're using. However, when it comes to your profiles that your camera has, that's going to be different, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. First tip that I'm going to give you guys is make sure that you're shooting at 24 frames per second. The golden standard that everybody shoots in when you see a cinematic Hollywood film is usually 24 frames a second. This is how it's always been. This is how they still do it now. How Hollywood films have that unique look. A lot of times it can be kind of hard to explain on exactly what it is that you're seeing, but it's the frame rate. If you're shooting at 30 frames a second, 60 frames per second, or even 120 frames a second, it's not going to look the same as film. You'll notice that as you start to bump it up at 30 frames a second, it starts to look a little bit smoother. So 60 frames a second, even smoother than that. And then 120 frames a second, well, you know, super smooth. And you'll notice this when you, if you have like a smart TV or, you know, an advanced TV where you have the ability to change the frames per second, how everything just looks super smooth. It's not natural, definitely does not give off the cinematic look. However, if you are going to shoot some slow motion shots, then that's when you'd want to not shoot in 24 frames a second, but shooting something higher, such as 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. Shooting at a higher frame rate like this allows you to take all the shots that you have done and slow it down in post, giving you that silky smooth look. Moving on to the next tip is your shutter speed. Essentially what you want to do with your shutter speed is take your frame rates and then you double that number by 2. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you want to make sure that you're shooting at 1/48 for your shutter speed. However, most cameras, like this camera right here, the Sony a6300, does not have that option to shoot at 1/48 for your shutter speed. However, you do have the option for 1/50. So that's what you want to set it at. Make sure that you set your shutter speed to 1/50 when you're shooting at 24 frames a second. If you're shooting at 60 frames a second, then you just double that. So you'd put your shutter speed at, well, in this case with the Sony a6300, 1/125. And so on. If you're shooting at 24 frames a second and you shoot at a lower shutter speed, you'll notice that you get a lot of choppy looking images when you go to play it back, which is not settling and looks like crap. And if you're shooting at a higher frame rate, well, it just looks off. Something about it just doesn't look right. It's not cinematic whatsoever. When you have movement, if something is a still shot, well, you can't really tell. But if you have any kind of movement in it, such as the movie like, say, Saving Private Ryan, with a lot of the action scenes when these guys are fighting, you'll notice that it just looks, something looks different about how the shots are being shot. So keep that in mind whenever you set your settings to 24 frames a second. Make sure that you go back and look at your shutter speed and make sure that it's 1/50. Which automatically rolls us into our next tip, which is neutral density filter. I would highly recommend that you guys go out and get a variable neutral density filter. Looks like this, and essentially what this thing does is it's sunglasses for your camera. You'll notice that if you go and shoot anything in the daytime, anything with its like nicely lit scene, and you set your shutter speed to 1/50, and then you take down your aperture to where, you know, it's like 1/4, 1/7, whatever, everything is going to be blown out. Now, if you're shooting any kind of photography, it'd be okay to just go ahead and bump up your shutter speed. That way it makes the image a whole lot more darker, and you can still have that aperture of a 1.4, 1.7, 2.8, whatever. However, when it comes to shooting video, if you up the shutter speed, well, it's going to make it look off like we were just talking about. So you want to make sure that you counteract that with something like a variable ND filter. Nice thing about these, instead of just a regular ND filter is going to give you that standard look for whatever darkness the lens is. So if you slap it on, it may be a little bit too light and you need it to be darker, or you'll slap one on, it's a little bit too dark and you need it to be a little bit lighter. But if you get one like this, you simply just adjust it. And by being able to do this allows you to control your exposure quite well to give you that really nice shallow depth of field look that a lot of cinematic films have. The next tip that we're going to be talking about is gimbal. Fly cam, steady cam, a gimbal, any kind of unit that will allow you to get silky smooth shots is going to make everything ultimately look more cinematic. When you're watching any kind of Hollywood films, a lot of shots, you can tell, are all done with some kind of gimbal. Boom, everything is super smooth. However, you do have some of those shots that are really shaky and meant to look that way, like handheld shots. Handheld shots definitely have their place when shooting film. However, to make your footage look cinematic, bump it up to the next level, and give you that really professional look, you should probably be using some kind of gimbal. The kind of gimbal that I use is the Zhiyun Crane 2. Awesome gimbal. I've had it for pretty much the entire summer rolling into winter time, and I have absolutely no complaints right now. I'll actually drop a whole review video on that specific gimbal a little bit later on if you guys are interested, so make sure that you check back for that. If you can't afford something like the Zhiyun Crane 2 or the Ronin M or any other kind of gimbal, there is other options such as like a Flycam or a Steadicam. The Flycam that I used to have was like the Flycam 3000, I believe. Got it for like 120 bucks, and it is kind of a pain in the ass to get balanced, but once you do get it balanced, it does work quite well. Only problem with these things is, at least with the Flycam that I had, is if you bump it just a little bit, it throws it off balance, and then you gotta sit there all over again trying to rebalance it. It's just such a pain in the ass to just tweak it a little bit here, a little bit there. I'd rather just get my gimbal nicely balanced. I also shoot with the Sigma 18-35, so it does give me a focal length of 18 millimeters, and I can bump it up to 35 millimeters, which works perfectly well for all the music videos and stuff that I shoot. And I don't have to sit there and worry about rebalancing anything. Last tip that I'm really going to talk about is color grading. I'm going to drop an entire video talking about how I color grade, the easiest way to color grade, and quite honestly, a fast way to color grade, in a whole nother video. If you use the standard profile in your camera, it's basically the camera is selecting its own colors for your video, adding its own saturation, adding its own contrast. If you shoot in your own profile, such as Cine 2, Cine 4, S-Log 2 or 3, anything different than regular standard profile, it'll give you some more dynamic range, which ultimately helps you a whole lot more in post for lowering or raising your shadows, messing with your highlights, and being able to add and take away colors that you would like. If you do a little bit of research, you look online, a lot of people will really be praising S-Log 2, S-Log 3 because of the fact that it has a lot of dynamic range. You can mess a lot with the exposure, the colors, taking down your shadows, lifting up your highlights. You have a whole lot more room to work with shooting S-Log 2, S-Log 3. Cine 4 is another good option to use. Cine 2, another great option to use. You just got to kind of go through all the profiles, see which one works out best for you. Once you have found that profile that works for you, now you can upload your video into whatever kind of software that you're using in post. Go ahead and add in, take away your colors, lift your highlights, drop your shadows, get that S-curve going, make everything look super nice, and give you that cinematic look. If you guys want to know exactly which settings that I'm using in my camera, I'm going to be dropping another video on that here shortly, so make sure that you hit that subscribe button, hit the little bell icon so that way you know when the next video is being uploaded, and then you guys can just take those settings that I have and apply them to your camera to get a very, very similar look. I'm going to be dropping some other videos too, like talking about how to color grade with LUTs, the kind of LUTs that I use, you know, how to import LUTs, export LUTs, make your own LUTs. And you know what, I'll even add some LUTs and I'll put them down in the description to where you guys can download them and use them on your own material. But hey, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. If you guys like this video, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. Go ahead and try some of these tips to make your footage look cinematic. And if you have any questions whatsoever, be sure to drop that information down in the description below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Hit that subscribe button and I'll see you guys in the next one.